this is probably not a me problem. And I personalized every rejection and every condescension and every experience of abuse as something that is problematic about me.
Observation that's really stood out for me is the fact that even in 2023, only 5% of marriages in our country are intercaste.
There is a lot of pressure for Dalit women to be a certain way in order to be accepted as normal, so to say. I think it's okay to get married. I think it's okay not to get married. I think it's okay to do anything that you need to be doing to survive, to thrive. Do what you need to do in order to get by.
I'm Leeza Mangaldas, and this is Love Matters. And today I'm in conversation with Christina Dhanuja about caste, desire, and gender with a focus on lived experiences. Christina is the co founder of Dalit History Month, and much of her work is focused on challenging the existing narrative around Dalit women. In fact, she's currently working on a book about Dalit women and the fullness of life. Christina's work has spanned several continents, and today she is joining me from New York. Welcome to Love Matters, Christina. We're so glad to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me, Lisa. It's lovely to be here.
I wanted to start with a quote that I read in one of the articles you wrote that really struck with me. I'm just going to read it to you. It was about your early experiences while dating in college when you assumed that caste identity was something that wouldn't matter. And you wrote, I believed love conquered everything. I couldn't have been further from the truth. I'd love for you to expound on that because I've been so sort of moved by how personal and candid much of your writing is. You always draw from your lived experiences, and you know, as the reader, I find that so powerful.
I believe that quote is from this essay that I had written, one of my first essays titled Swipe Me Left, I Am Dalit. And this was commissioned by Gender IT, wherein we were trying to look at how technology and caste and love and romance all came together within the context of an interpersonal experience, the context being me. I mean, how else do you write, right? Like you base your thoughts and your articulations on personal experience, but that's particularly true and extremely valuable for Dalit women authors and Dalit women writers because there are no precedents out there and around, say, for example, around desirability and love and how that sort of became what it is today. Influenced by pop culture, by history, by conversations around us. And how do you really make sense of all that? I started off with this understanding that love is the most powerful emotion that's out there, that is going to heal all of us, that is going to conquer everything, as the quote said. And with love, nothing can come in between, whether it is caste or class or any sort of power differential is not going to hold a candle before true love. But what is true love really? Right. And for me, as a young Tamil person who grew up in the 90s with cinema that continued to glorify love and in various ways, I just assumed. I mean, I grew up in a very regular Dalit Christian family that had its own set of own set of restrictions influenced by both Christianity as well as caste rules and a whole bunch of limits that were imposed upon me. But nonetheless, I think when I first encountered love, romantic love, I assumed that it's all going to be great because it is love after all, only to realize that there are so many other aspects to it, right? There's, of course, there's caste, which is the way Indian society, most of Indian society functions. But beyond caste, there are also other things with which caste interacts. Um, so initially, while it was a very disappointing experience, I would tell myself that, everyone goes through these things. This is a struggle. And funnily enough, every time I was at that depressing juncture of rejection and, trying to get past that, I would be given a quote, or a quote would just appear of people saying, you have to open up to love, because, do that again, because go all the way, love is a struggle. And there's a whole bunch of influential quotes that's floating around us. And then I would take another step and I would be like, okay, maybe this would be different, maybe this would be different. And so it just went on for years together, till the time I realized that, this is probably not a me problem. And I personalized every rejection and every condescension and every experience of abuse as something that is problematic about me. But after years and years and years, and knowing that knowing yourself and being so self aware and doing so much work on yourself, at some point in time, you have to realize, and that happened to me. And I'm really thankful that it did, because at some point I said, this is probably not a me problem. This is a systemic issue. Not always do we talk about it that way, as far as love is concerned, as far as romance is concerned, but this is probably a systemic issue. And from there on, I think I also set a lot of personal boundaries. And I'm really glad I did that, because where I am today is in an extremely healthy relationship, which is so accepting and so beautiful, that the only regret I have is, why didn't this happen sooner? That I could have spent, longer with this person. Yeah.
I will certainly ask you more about your husband. He's a lucky man. But I also wanted to just harp on this idea of systemic forces that shape, you know, our dating behaviors and our desirability and who we desire. And I just sort of within that article as well, you spoke of how your Savarna friends, for example, had quite different experiences.
But I want to take a step back, and I want to sort of, and this is also a learning that I've had in the recent past, since I wrote that piece. I want to sort of point out that it's quite um, understandable why we go into this traps of looking at everything within a Savarna versus Dalit binary, but that's not always how things play out in reality, right? Like, theoretically speaking, it's easier to sort of slip into that binary, but in reality, people are living very complex, intricate, you know, overlapping lives, and are having different sorts of experiences depending upon who they are and how they look and how they carry themselves, who they interact with. So it's really confusing and complex and intricate, that goes beyond the Savarna Dalit binary. So I would like us to understand two things. One is that I think within Indian society, South Asian society, or any society that is heavily caste contoured, regardless of whether it is within a romantic context or not, we ascribe value to individuals, collectives, families, and communities based on caste. That is the primary determinant to how we ascribe value to people. Perhaps it's happening subconsciously, in some cases also consciously, but mostly we are not, it's not at the in the front and center of our brains. Rather, what we are looking for are markers we have constructed consciously or subconsciously. And like you say, we don't talk about it, but it is there in our minds about who this ideal is. So when all of us have a certain value, there is someone who holds the highest value, or a collective or a group of individuals that are a 5 on 5 or a 10 on 10, how much ever we want to ascribe the final value is. So we have an ideal in mind. And I think particularly within romantic contexts, we have decided as people, not through a conference or whatever, but over a period of time, we have decided that this ideal will be someone who is of a certain body shape, of a certain skin color, of a certain hair texture, of a certain class location, of a certain caste location. So there are these markers that point to a certain ideal. So yes, indeed. In my article, I talk quite a bit about, how Savarna friends of mine had a different sort of a journey when it came to their romantic relationships, and this was something that I often noticed is that they would have their, fun, their whole phase or whatever, but that would have very less impact on at least the generation that I grew up in. I have noticed with Dalit people and particularly with Dalit women who I feel are who are pressured to meet different standards, higher standards of morality and chastity. And that was also a survival tactic for them because they were at risk of facing caste based sexual violence at work or anywhere else. And so they would put on these very austere masks, or perhaps they were austere themselves. So it's partly coming from there too. But again, I think externally too, there is a lot of pressure for Dalit women to be a certain way, in order to be accepted as as normal, so to say. While that's not the standard that most Savarna women or most Savarna people have to seem to be abiding by. So I would love to hear about how your experiences have been, and what are some of the experiences that you went through, or any observations that you've noticed as to how Savarna people approach this? Would you agree with what I said, or um, would you differ? Would you think that your observations have been um, starkly different from what I have mentioned?
I think growing up, I wasn't sufficiently aware of my own privilege. And I think that I only really began understanding the realities of caste and how my own social landscape maybe participated in the sort of inequalities that exist in our society much later on. And I suppose that that is a factor of being from an oppressor caste group, to have the fantasy of, I don't know caste, or caste doesn't exist in my life, is something I suppose only people who are some form of oppressor caste um, can experience. So I mean, a statistic or observation that's really stood out for me is the fact that even in 2023, only 5% of marriages in our country are intercaste. For me, I mean, marriage is just an institution that doesn't resonate.
I was that person. I was this person when I was growing up, thinking that I was never going to get married. Marriage is a really evil institution. It probably is. And a whole bunch of other things, very, very classic feminist in that sense. But I also realized while I was getting married and while I was during my search of finding the person, while I was going through the preparations for the wedding, I also sort of realized how different, for the lack of a better word, how different my situation is, my reality is, and by extension, the reality of a lot of Dalit women, particularly Dalit women. Yeah, I wanted to say Dalit women and men, but then I don't think perhaps this does not fully apply to Dalit men, but particularly with Dalit women, how our situations are different in the sense that it demands a certain legitimate relationship in order to exist in the society, in order to live fully in society. And so this is not to say that all Dalit women must get married, or it's better that all Dalit women get married. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I don't think making a choice, and this is something that I realized through my experience of reality vis a vis the liberal theory that I was trying to ascribe to, was that I should not I should not be ashamed to make a choice that is that I make for survival, that I make for living a better life than what my ancestors did. And I don't want Dalit women, and I say this as I'm saying this to myself, I don't want Dalit women to be pressured into making decisions, whether it is pro marriage or, anti marriage, to be making those decisions based on an artificial, based on, not artificial, but based on just entirely theorized cerebral sort of a standard. Um, because what is the alternative? So in my case, that's how I went about it. Can I really, and I remember being this massive fan of this book called The New Single Woman, which was written by a white author. Perhaps you've read it. It was an amazing book. It spoke about, it gave really practical tips around, how do you create a full life if you choose not to get married? And I was like, damn it, this is what I'm going to do. This is the person. I am the new single woman. And this I would be doing at a time when, in the midst of extremely abusive relationships with extremely horrible casteist men who were condescending, who were casteist, who were racist, who were everything that you would not want to be with. And I would tell myself that these are the things that I would be doing because that's what I'm destined for. I can't have a relationship, and therefore I would need to be doing these things. And the things that this author spoke about was having a very strong friend circle, a set of things to do, being creative, being passionate about things, finding ways to be sensual and sexual, whatever that means to you. And finally, to have some sort of a relationship with the younger generation, whether it's through your church or through your work or through your extended family, whatever it is. But all of these things need to exist for us to survive. Like we need that community, we need that infrastructure, that emotional infrastructure to survive, if particularly if we are choosing no marriage. And I don't think that infrastructure is always available for Dalit women, and at least it was not available for me. So I all that I'm trying to say is that it's very interesting, but I think for Dalit women, particularly caste marginalized women who are under resourced, and by under resourced, I don't just mean material resources, but also emotional resources, psychological resources. I think it's okay to get married. I think it's okay not to get married. I think it's okay to do anything that you need to be doing to survive, to thrive. Do what you need to do in order to get by.
Can we also talk about the beautiful photographs behind you? I assume one
Oh,
is
oh
of your
yeah.
wedding.
Yes, it
Um,
is.
I want to hear about how you met your partner, if you'd be willing to share.
Ben is truly a gift, and and I'm not exaggerating at all. There are moments when I think, did this really happen? Like, is this real? Am I going to wake up from this dream? And I feel like my brain goes on an overdrive in terms of anxiety because it's not able to handle happiness. It's not able to handle this much peace in the relationship, this much love. It's not able to handle it because it's like something's going to go wrong. Something's going to go wrong. And that's how anxiety works, right? Like, it's if you're going to bombard your brain and your body with so much trauma, particularly trauma that comes from interpersonal relationships. Of course, trauma, interpersonal relationships is the biggest source of trauma, but particularly romantic interpersonal relationships I've been with people who have been extremely condescending, not just about my social location, but about my family, my skin color, my body shape, just rejection all out, and just all the time, incessantly, constantly, different kinds of rejection, but while being fetishized sexually. And so to be in such a situation, like, all the time for years together, can really do things to your brain. Like, your brain's like, what's happening? Is this true? Is this for real? Is this person for good? There's a whole bunch of things that you go through as a battered person, and it's really embarrassing to talk about rejections all the time. Like, I want to be able to talk about how attractive I am and how charming I am, and how what a goddess I am in bed. Like, I would like to talk about all of those things. I would like to position myself that way, rather but to have experiences that seem to be taking a higher percentage in your life, which is of rejection and condescension and trauma. It's quite embarrassing at some level. But going back to what you asked about Ben, the way we met and the way Ben narrates the story is that it was love at first read, um, which I find very cheesy. But in truth, that's how we met. He was preparing towards a piece that he needed to write about diversity, caste-based diversity within the development sector. He was a William J. Clinton Fellow at that time, with the American Indian Foundation, and he wanted to interview someone who had approached this topic, but he wanted to interview a Dalit woman. And so he just went about looking for that person, and he found me, and he slid into my DMs in true millennial fashion, which I didn't see for 3 weeks. And then I did. And it was this really beautiful, um, paragraphs, these beautiful paragraphs around what he has felt as a Dalit man, looking for romance. And by the way, I would like to interview you for a piece that I'm writing. And so we got talking, and then he wrote the article, it got published. But I felt something, I guess. I was in Beijing at that time, and he was in India. And so I was like, hey, what's up? How you doing? And he came down to meet me in Beijing. And he was very sure of it initially. I took some time to ease into it. But I remember this particular moment at work. Um, I wanted to come back home to him. And I was like, wait, this feels very different, and this feels so beautiful. Like, I hadn't felt that in a really, really long time. And I think at some point during that evening, I knew this was my person.
Thank you for sharing that. And since we've been talking about, what makes someone desirable, or why and how we end up feeling desire, what do you see as the most desirable qualities in a partner?
I think this person who can sort of see you in your most embarrassing, most awkward, most really pathetic state, and still be able to love you. I think that to me is the most desirable quality in a partner. And it's great to have chemistry. It's great to have, attraction. Like, I forget the name of that character, but she was the protagonist of the first season in Bridgerton, when who then talks to her brother in the second season and tells him that if this is the person that you can't even think with, like, sorry, if in the presence of this person you're unable to even think, then that's love. And that limerence is great. And it's so fun to go through that. But eventually, in a long-term relationship, such as a marriage or such as a monogamous, or even in a committed polyamorous relationship, you will have to get to a point where you must be vulnerable to this person. You have to show parts of yourself. There is no such thing as I won't change for you. I mean, there's no such thing as that. We change, we evolve, we change for our people, we change for the people that we love, and they change for us, and we make people change. We force people to change based on our behaviors and our demands. And so all of this really needs to come together, and this person, this partner, needs to be needs to have the grit and the resilience to go with you through that. And I think nothing but that can constitute desire for me.
Thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. And now, as we conclude this interview, given that so much of your work revolves around changing the existing narrative around caste and desire, I want to ask you what you think too many of us too often get wrong in our approach.
I think one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface around what caste experiences feel like and look like when it comes to love and romance and sex positivity and sexuality. um, I think we are only beginning to do that. And I'm also a little apprehensive about how much Western language and Western articulations we borrow from, and they may not necessarily always be applicable to South Asian contexts. And so there's definitely a need for novel thinking. There's definitely a need for creating a body of work that is original and authentic and very much based on our experiences. And that is the best, that I think is the most um, is the right way to go about approaching this whole thing. This is not to say that we completely ignore everything that Western articulations have taught us. There's a lot to gain from it. There's Black feminist thought, there is Indigenous women's thought. Like, there's just so much to gain from all of that. But at the same time, I think there's definitely space for us to sort of create our own thinking and articulate our own experiences and create a body of work that's authentic and original. Secondly, I think it's not so much about what people can do, but it's also about how they can be. Like, how does caste apply? Like, for example, instead of thinking about how caste is affecting and having consequences in caste marginalized people's lives, maybe it would be a good thing to sort of flip that and talk about how caste is enabling you to have power and access and capital, social capital within interpersonal relationships. And that sort of thinking and that sort of articulation is definitely important and very much needed from upper caste people, from people who occupy privileged upper caste locations. And I think that is going to sort of revolutionize the way we are approaching all of these things, because it is also deeply disheartening uh, to constantly think about just caste marginalized lives when you're thinking about caste. It's very tiring and it's very, very exhausting to be doing that. So I think there's definitely that bit that we need to take into account.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much. I really thank you. Really, really grateful that you could do this with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Lisa. It was wonderful talking to you.
And thank you for tuning into Love Matters. If you'd like to read more of Christina's writing, as well as more about her work, we're going to leave her website in our show notes. We also would love it if you shared this podcast with your friends, rated it wherever you're listening, and left us a comment with your thoughts. You can also write to us at lovematters@dw.com. Love Matters is produced by the Indian Express and DW, Germany's international broadcaster. I'm Leeza Mangaldas, and I believe love matters.